All right, welcome back. We are continuing our build series on the Truggy build that I'm doing, and I am going to focus this video on bag 2, which is building the shocks. So switching into our table view here, you can see that I already have emptied all the bags, all bag 2 bags on the table, and I've organized everything. We kind of got the main shock parts here and some of the other plastic and hardware over here with the seals. Again, normally when I build, I'll build them all at the same time. So like put all the O-rings on all 4 shocks, etc. But to speed this video along, I'm just gonna do one shock again. So we'll do one of these rear shocks. So yeah, let's get started. So the first thing I always do is get these shock bodies, and I just start putting these O-rings on. So we put this one right here on the body, and then we get this big one here and we stick it in the collar. Kind of have to like feed this thing in, it kind of sticks out, and you just kind of massage that thing in there. You get that in. And then I will take some shock oil and I'll stick a little on my finger here and rub that seal on the shock oil just to make it easier to install. So then we push this, and this is critical. You kind of have to push this thing all the way down before you start so you don't cross thread the body. So just kind of push it as much as you can on all sides first. Got a little oil on this thing now from all that shock oil I put on it, so clean that off. And then I normally just thread these all pretty much almost all the way up, just to make adjustments more uniformly when you finally get these on the car. So keep on twisting this thing. Yeah, we're just gonna go to there. So yeah, we got that on. The next thing I do here is I start loading the shock cartridge. So we're gonna start putting these O-rings in. And to do that, it's going to require these parts to be cut off the tree. I like to use an X-acto for these, and you just kind of get this X-acto right on the edge and pop it off. And sometimes you don't quite get it all the way, and you can just trim it like so. There's also, I have these end cutters. These end cutters work pretty good too. You can come in here, they're like super close cutting end cutters, and you can use end cutters to do this. Just got to make sure you get it really close so you don't leave any flashing. And if you do, like that one, you just come in here with the X-acto and trim it off. All right, so the next step here is we put these O-rings in the body, and I like to lubricate the O-rings with this ProTech O-ring grease. I just get one, I grab my smaller hex driver here, and I take one of these and I kind of just put it in this O-ring grease and get it all nice and lubricated, and then you just drop it in there. And the next thing is, there's 2 types of spacers. There's one that's kind of like a hat spacer, and then there's this one that's a solid spacer. And so the solid one is the one that goes in next. So you stick that solid one in, and then you're going to grab another one of these O-rings do the same thing here with the grease. Just get some, that's a lot of grease, but that's fine. Stick that in, stick that in there. Then we, from here, are gonna put in this hat section, and the larger or the wider portion goes down towards the seal. So you kind of get that little lip there sticking out. And then from there, you tighten this thing on, this shock retainer. And for me, I don't like to tighten these all the way down until I insert the shock shaft. And the reason why I like that, these will sometimes push on the O-ring and make it a little bit tighter. And so I find it easier to push the shock shaft through with this a little bit loose. So I leave that a little bit loose. Okay, so the next step is we're gonna build these shock shafts, and these are rear shocks, so we're gonna take the longer shock shaft. And you take these washers, if I can get them, and you stick one of them on there. And then you get these pistons here. I need to examine these. Okay, so looking at these pistons after I inspected them a little bit closer, they have numbers on the back. They're pretty small. They're right up here kind of at the top. And so there's 3 options of pistons. There's a 6 by 1.3 millimeter flat piston, which you can see is just a constant cross-sectional thickness. And then there's a 1.3 and a 1.2 tapered piston. So you can see hopefully you can see that the taper, it's kind of like a conical section. So it's not, one side is tapered and the other side, this side's flat and this side is tapered. And so for this build, the stock build, they're saying to use the 1.2 tapered pistons on all sides. And so we're gonna go ahead and cut those off the tree. I'm just gonna do one for now for this build. We'll get this little flashing off of there. All right, that looks good. So then back to our shock shaft build here. And so the taper, when you're using tapered pistons, for the stock build anyway, that taper points down. And the taper gives you, whichever direction you put it in, it's a little bit faster. So in this case, you would have a faster rebound than compression. So then you put one more washer, and then you put this lock nut on here. And these lock nuts, they have nylock on them, but if you're ever taking these apart and you notice the nylock is kind of weak, you either want to replace that nylock or thread lock these in so you don't lose a piston in the middle of a race. Okay, so then to finish tightening this, I have a pair of shock pliers. These are really handy because it doesn't scar up the shaft when you use it. But if you don't have them, you can use like a paper towel and some pliers. But ideally, if you get some shock pliers to do this task, and I always put the shock pliers down here by the threads. So these threads here for the rod end, because that's going to be the least amount of travel going through your O-rings and the shock body. And then you grab this is a 5 millimeter. It's the only spot where they use 5 millimeter in this buggy kit. So normally the it's a 5.5 millimeter. So you just screw this thing down, and the nylock feels really good, so you might have to get a little force on these to get them to... Yep, so there we go. That is on. Let's put these back up here. So now the next thing is installing the shock shaft into the body. And I always want to do that through the side that the oil goes in. So when you push the shaft through, you push all the excess O-ring grease out of the shock and not into it. Like some people will push the shaft through and then install the piston. Like a lot of times when you're changing out pistons, you can do that. But just generally speaking, I push it through this way. And I'll kind of rotate the shock body to ease pushing this through the O-rings. And you can see the O-ring grease kind of oozing out there on the end of the shaft. And so you push that through, and then finally come back and tighten this collar that I mentioned, and then just quickly wipe off the excess O-ring grease. That's gone. So yeah, now the next step is going to be to install one of these rod ends. We'll cut it off the tree here. While we're doing it, we might as well cut one of these off too, the spring retainer. All right. Okay, so the next step here, we're going to stick this boot on, push the shaft through and work this boot on here. And you know, if you're running a 10th scale carpet car, or pretty much 10th scale in general, they don't have these boots, but an 8th scale, because they're typically in a lot dirtier environments, we run these boots to keep the dirt out of the O-rings. So then once you do that, you can thread this rod end on. And sometimes it can be tough to grip this thing enough so it doesn't spin. With these pliers, don't provide as much leverage as I would really like. Okay, that's in. And I already put this grommet in, but just to show you guys, it's pretty easy. You just take it in here and grab a pair of RoboGit grip pliers and pop that in like so. So that's how that's done. Keep this thing a little more organized here. Okay. Okay, so the next step here is we're gonna put the bladder. I'm gonna build these shocks bladder. There's two types of shocks you can build. You can use a bladder or you can do emulsion. Normally I run emulsion just because I find that it's easier for me to build a consistent shock emulsion. But these AE shock caps and bladders I think are really good. I really like the feel and how these bladders work. So I'm going to build this thing with a bladder instead of emulsion. So you just kind of, this thing you can see there's kind of a smooth side and a rougher side, and this smooth side sticks out. And it's kind of like the seal in the shock. And so you push this thing down in. It's really important that you make sure this thing gets seated properly in this cap. there's part of the reason that I like these AE caps so much is they have 4 holes. So when you install the bladder, it allows the oil to escape. And most shock caps only have 1 hole, and it's easy to trap some air when you install the shock cap, or it traps some excess oil, which it can cause a hydro lock. And so I really like these caps. They have 4 holes. I'm just kind of looking. These holes shouldn't be blocked. The seal should be just under them, so I'm just trying to make sure. So yeah, that looks good. So the next step here is we're gonna put oil in these shocks, and we're again sticking with the stock setup from the package. And so this is 35 weight oil going in the rear shocks. And so what you want to do is you fill this thing up. You want to fill it up maybe like a 1/2 inch, probably 1/4 inch from the top. And then you want to push this piston up slowly and then bring it back down, and it releases the air that's on the back side of the piston. And maybe do it a couple more times. You can get a lot of air in a 10th scale shock if you're using internal limiters as well, so be careful with that. But get all that air bubbles out, and you give it a little time. On bladder, you want to make sure all the air is out. On emulsion, it's less critical. But then you fill this thing now all the way up to the top. Pretty far to the top here. Okay, so once you get this thing filled up with oil and all the air bubbles have been released, then you want to move your shock shaft to where you want for rebound. I probably put a little too much shock oil in this, but I like no rebound. And so what I mean by rebound is when you push this shaft all the way up, when you let go, it'll come down some. And like full rebound would have it come all the way down, and half rebound would have it come half down. But I prefer no rebound. So I push this thing all the way up. And then you install this cap. And when you install the cap, you might have to go backwards just to get the threads to kind of align, and then screw it on. And you can see the oil coming out of those holes, which is good. It means you don't have any air in there. I got a little too much oil, but you get all that out, and you can, if you need to, use some cleaner, but we'll just wipe it off here with the towel. I like to do these, I just hand tighten them, like use this shop towel and tighten them by hand. And they work pretty well. They do make tools you can use if you really want to crank them down. But yeah, I just hand tighten it. Okay, so once you get this cap tight, then I like to just feel how the shock feels, and it feels really smooth, which means I didn't get any air. And there's a little bit of rebound, but part of it is just from this rubber. The biggest thing is when you build the second shock, make sure that they're similar rebound characteristics. You want your shocks to be as close as possible. And then in the instruction manual, it shows installing this little screw and this little white washer, which I'm not even sure you guys can see, but it's super small washer. But I actually do not like installing that screw for Bladder, because is what happens with the shock is when you push up, the bladder expands out and you let some of the air out, and then when you pull this back in, it pulls the bladder in, and that's how you compensate for the shock shaft going in and out of the oil. And so I like to leave that hole open, and I will normally point it down in the car, but I like to leave it open to allow for that oil to enter. The only time you're going to use this screw and washer is when you build an emulsion shock. Okay, so the next step here, and it's the final step for assembling these shocks, is putting the spring on. And you just stick this spring on. I always put my paint stripe towards the top, but you can decide how you want to do that. And you put that in there and you pull this dust seal and spring back and slide this in like so. And you can see there's a little tab on this rod end. Hopefully you can see that. It's right here. And that tab slides into the notch cut out for the spring retainer. And so now we have the spring on the shock. And it feels really good. I like to always install this slot pointed out from the car. So if this was in the back, it would look kind of like this. So the notch, hopefully you can see that, the notch points this way and the hole points down for the emulsion. There's this side you can see, so that points up and the hole points down for emulsion. But that concludes building the shocks. The rest of this hardware here and here is to install it on the car, and we'll be doing that later. But I hope you find this video useful, and like I said, I'm not going to build the other 3 on video, but they're the same exact way. So we'll do that off camera. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe.